You are conscious right now. You know you are. That knowledge, that immediate first-person certainty, the undeniable fact of your own experience, is the only thing you know with absolute confidence. You can doubt the external world. You can doubt your memories. You can doubt whether your perceptions are accurate. You cannot doubt that there is something it is like to be you right now reading this. And science cannot explain it. Not for lack of trying, not for lack of data. Neuroscience has made extraordinary progress mapping which brain states correspond to which experiences. We can identify the neural correlates of visual perception, of emotional states, of the difference between conscious and unconscious processing. The mapping is increasingly precise. But the explanation, why brain states are accompanied by subjective experience at all, why there is something it feels like to be a brain rather than just processing happening in the dark, is entirely absent. No current theory addresses it. Not because we haven't looked, because the question is different in kind from every other scientific question we've successfully answered. That's what I want to examine, precisely. Every other scientific problem has the same basic structure. You explain how a system produces a behavior or property in terms of its components and their interactions. Explain digestion, chemical reactions, enzymes, absorption. The explanation works by showing how the macroscopic phenomenon, food being broken down and absorbed, follows from molecular level processes. More detail, better instruments, the phenomenon becomes understood. The hard problem of consciousness is not this kind of problem. And recognizing that it's not is the first step. Suppose you had a complete description of my brain right now. Every neuron, every synapse, every firing pattern, every neurotransmitter concentration, every molecular state. Complete, down to the level of individual atoms. And suppose you watched all of this activity, the electrochemical patterns propagating through my cortex, the global broadcasting of information across prefrontal and parietal regions, the precise dynamics of the 100 trillion synaptic connections. Would that description explain why there is something it feels like to have those patterns? Would it explain the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the character of musical experience? Would it explain why any of this is accompanied by experience rather than occurring without anyone inside? The answer appears to be no. The description, however complete, describes the processing from the outside. Experience is from the inside. No matter how detailed the third-person description becomes, it seems to leave the first-person fact untouched. The physical description and the experiential fact remain separated by a gap that more physical description doesn't close. David Chalmers named this the hard problem in 1995. Not because consciousness is more complicated than other phenomena, though it is, but because the standard methodology that works for every other scientific problem appears insufficient for this one. Other problems are hard in degree. This one may be hard in kind. The easy problems, how the brain integrates information, how it focuses attention, how it generates reports about internal states, how it produces behavior, are hard in the technical sense, but they are tractable. More neuroscience, better models, progress accumulates. The hard problem is, why is any of this accompanied by experience? That question hasn't moved. Not because researchers are lazy or incurious, because it doesn't yield to the standard methods. What neuroscience has established is substantial and real, and it's worth being precise about what it is and where it stops. Neural correlates of consciousness, specific patterns of brain activity that reliably accompany specific conscious experiences. When you consciously perceive a face, identifiable regions activate in coordinated patterns. When anesthesia renders you unconscious, those patterns change in specific, measurable ways. When brain damage eliminates a specific aspect of conscious experience, the ability to recognize faces, the ability to see color, the sense of a unified self, the damaged region is identifiable. This is genuine knowledge. It tells us which brain states go with which experiences, with increasing precision. The line it can't cross: neurocorrelates explain correlation. They don't explain why correlation exists, why those brain states are accompanied by experience rather than occurring without experience. A perfect atlas of neurocorrelates would still be a correlation map. The explanation of why the correlations hold is a different question. The map is not the explanation. The most robust finding from neuroscience regarding consciousness involves what happens when information transitions from unconscious to conscious processing. Researchers have compared brain states during conscious versus unconscious processing of identical stimuli, using masking techniques where a stimulus is processed but not perceived, or studying patients who process information they cannot consciously report. The consistent finding: conscious processing involves widespread broadcasting of information across the brain, particularly involving frontal and parietal regions. Unconscious processing is local. Specific regions process the stimulus, but that processing doesn't propagate widely. Consciousness correlates with global broadcast. This is important. It tells us something real about the architecture of conscious processing. It doesn't tell us why global broadcasting is accompanied by experience. The broadcasting could, in principle, occur without experience. The correlation is established. The explanation is not. Several theoretical frameworks attempt to address this. Each has genuine virtues and honest limitations. Global workspace theory, developed by Bernard Bars and extended by Stanislas de Haan, proposes that consciousness arises when information is broadcast into a global workspace, a system accessible to many different cognitive processes simultaneously. What you're conscious of is what's in the workspace. What's processed locally, without broadcast, is unconscious. This framework explains real things. It accounts for the capacity limits of consciousness, why you can only be conscious of a limited amount at once. It explains why conscious information influences behavior broadly, while unconscious information influences specific processes. It provides a good functional account of attention and awareness. What it doesn't explain: why global broadcasting is accompanied by experience. The global workspace could in principle do everything it does: integrate information, make it broadly available, influence behavior without any subjective experience. The theory explains the function. It doesn't address the phenomenology. It's a theory of which information becomes accessible, not a theory of why accessibility feels like something. Integrated information theory, developed by Giulio Tononi, takes a different approach. Consciousness in this framework is identical to integrated information. The degree to which a system generates more information as a unified whole than as the sum of its parts. This is measured by a quantity called phi. High phi means high consciousness. Zero phi means no consciousness. IIT offers something that GWT doesn't: a mathematical framework, a specific, in-principle measurable quantity. It makes counterintuitive predictions that certain simple, highly integrated networks could be more conscious than complex networks with low integration. That could in principle be tested if we could calculate phi for large systems. The problem? We can't. Phi is computationally intractable for systems the size of a human brain, and the framework rests on an assumption that consciousness is identical to integrated information, that isn't derived from anything more fundamental. Why would integrated information be experience? IIT posits this equivalence. It doesn't derive it. The hard problem reappears at the foundation. IIT also implies that the Internet might be conscious, given sufficient integration. Many find this difficult to accept. Whether that difficulty is a prejudice or a legitimate objection is debated. Higher order theories propose that consciousness requires a mental state to be represented by a higher order state, a perception of a perception, a thought about a thought. You're conscious of an experience when some higher level cognitive process represents that experience. The problem is regress. What makes the higher order representation conscious? Another higher order representation? And what makes that one conscious? The framework pushes the question back a level without resolving it. Quantum proposals, the most prominent being the Penrose-Hameroff orchestrated objective reduction theory, suggest that consciousness arises from quantum processes in microtubules inside neurons. The motivation is partly that standard computational accounts seem insufficient, and quantum mechanics introduces something genuinely novel, objective reduction of wave functions that might generate experience. The objection is physical. The brain is warm and wet. Quantum coherence decoheres extremely rapidly in biological environments. Maintaining coherence on the timescales relevant to neural processing requires something that hasn't been demonstrated. Most physicists consider the proposal unsubstantiated. Though, and I want to be honest here, the hard problem is sufficiently hard that some researchers feel radical proposals deserve consideration rather than dismissal. Among philosophers of mind, there is an option that's considered genuinely live, not fringe, not dismissible, that most scientists find uncomfortable: panpsychism. The argument for it is clean. If consciousness doesn't arise from non-conscious physical processes, if there's always an explanatory gap between physical description and experience, then perhaps experience is not something that emerges. Perhaps it's fundamental, present in some form in all matter. Not that electrons have rich inner lives, but that some proto-experiential property is a basic feature of physical reality, and complex consciousness emerges from the combination of simpler experiential properties. David Chalmers, Galen Strawson, Philip Goff, serious philosophers, not mystics, defend this view as a coherent and possibly necessary response to the hard problem. If experience doesn't come from non-experience, and experience exists, experience must be basic. The problem panpsychism faces is called the combination problem. How do micro-level experiential properties, if electrons or atoms have something proto-experiential, combine to produce the unified, integrated experience you're having right now? The unity of consciousness, the fact that you have one experience rather than 86 billion separate neuronal experiences, is difficult to explain if experience is distributed at the level of fundamental particles. The combination problem may be as hard as the original hard problem. Why panpsychism remains in play? It takes the hard problem more seriously than any other framework. If the gap is real, if no amount of physical detail bridges it, then either experience is fundamental or it's eliminable. Eliminativism, the view that there's no such thing as experience, that the first-person perspective is an illusion, faces a specific problem. The claim there is no experience is itself made from inside an experience. Something is happening. The argument that nothing is happening is itself something happening. Illusionism, Keith Frankish's term for a sophisticated version of eliminativism, proposes that there are no qualia, no intrinsic experiential properties. The brain generates introspective representations that misrepresent its own processing, creating the impression of rich inner experience when there are only physical processes. Consciousness, as ordinarily conceived, is a kind of systematic misrepresentation. The objection that persists. Even if the brain misrepresents its own processing, the misrepresentation is itself an experience. Something is occurring. The argument for its non-existence occurs inside it. I find this objection difficult to get past, and I've tried. Let me say something about what a satisfying explanation of consciousness would actually look like. Because I think we don't know, and not knowing what the explanation would look like is itself part of the problem. For physics, chemistry, biology, we know what explanation looks like. Derive the macroscopic from the microscopic. Show how the phenomenon follows from the components and their interactions. The explanandum, the thing to be explained, is a third-person phenomenon, observable from outside. Consciousness is a first-person phenomenon. The explanandum is the inside. What would it mean to derive the inside from the outside? To show how subjective experience follows from objective physical processes. Every attempt to do this seems to either smuggle in experience at some level, making the derivation circular, or to leave the explanatory gap open. The hard problem may indicate that our current conceptual vocabulary is insufficient, that explaining consciousness requires concepts we don't yet have. Not more detailed neuroscience, but a different kind of understanding, one that either expands our concept of the physical to include something experiential, or dissolves the question by showing it was malformed. Neither has been achieved. We don't know which, if either, is possible. There is something I find genuinely novel about this problem, novel in a way that distinguishes it from every other problem in the history of science. Every scientific question is asked from inside consciousness. Every experiment is designed by a conscious mind. Every measurement is made by conscious instruments, and ultimately interpreted by conscious brains. Every theory is produced by conscious thinkers. Every test is run inside consciousness. Consciousness is not one phenomenon among many to be explained. It is the medium in which all explanation occurs. When physics explains gravity, the explanation is made from outside gravity. We can describe gravity without being gravity. When we try to explain consciousness, the explanation is made from inside consciousness. We cannot step outside it to examine it from a neutral vantage point. This is a genuinely novel situation. Physics has not encountered it before in this form. The tool is the object. The measuring instrument is the phenomenon under measurement. The strange loop is complete. Does this make consciousness inexplicable? Not necessarily. It means the standard third-person methodology, observe, measure, model, test, may be inherently incomplete for this problem. Not because the methodology is wrong, because the thing being observed is doing the observing. I have spent my career requiring precise predictions testable against measurement. That is the standard. I apply it strictly to everything I can apply it to. The Dirac equation predicts antimatter. The prediction is precise. The measurement confirms it or not. That is science. I find, with consciousness, that I cannot apply this standard in the usual way. Not because the question isn't real, because the measuring instrument is the phenomenon. Every measurement of consciousness is a conscious measurement. Every model of consciousness is produced by consciousness. Every test is run inside the thing being tested. The universe has produced, through 13.8 billion years of physical process, something capable of asking where it came from. That something is consciousness. And consciousness cannot step outside itself to find the answer in the standard way. Where does consciousness come from? I don't know. The neural correlates are well mapped. The theories GWT, IIT, higher order theories, quantum proposals, each capture something real and each fail to close the gap. The gap remains. The hard problem remains hard, in precisely the way it was when Chalmers named it. What I know is this: the question is asked from inside the answer. The inside has never, in the history of physics, been accessible from the outside. Every attempt to reach it from the outside has left something behind. That something is you, reading this, aware that you're reading it, and still not knowing why.